Now we're going to consider the determinants of supply elasticity, similar to the determinants of demand elasticity. And again, these are things that make the supply curve either flatter, more elastic, or steeper, more inelastic. There's 4 of them we're going to talk about. They're listed there for you on the PowerPoint slide. Those are the marginal cost of production, whether that cost goes up quickly or slowly, the market share of inputs, the geographic scope of the supply curve, and the time frame to which the supply curve pertains. That last one is quite similar to one of the determinants of demand. First up is marginal cost. So let's begin by defining what marginal cost means. When an economist talks about the marginal cost, the marginal benefit, the marginal something, marginal means the next of those units. So marginal cost means if I increase my output by 1 unit, how much extra is that 1 unit going to cost me? How much does it increase my total costs? So if marginal costs are increasing slowly, then that is going to give you a supply curve that is fairly flat. It increases slowly. It's elastic. Okay, suppliers can be fairly responsive to changes in price. And that is because if marginal cost increases slowly, then the price doesn't have to go up by very much before it can cover those extra marginal costs. On the other hand, if marginal cost increases quickly, then to increase output by very much, they're going to have a much higher increase in supply to cover those extra marginal costs. Okay, so an example of a good where the marginal cost increases rather slowly might be some product like toothpaste, where all of the inputs are relatively cheap to purchase, and if you want to get an extra 5%, 10% of toothpaste produced, you just buy those extra inputs and you crank up the factory. Okay, the marginal cost isn't going to go up that quickly. On the other hand, you could have an industry where the marginal cost increases relatively quickly. Maybe it's some industry where the labor involved is very difficult or unpleasant, like being a grave digger or being a commercial fisherman. So that there might be a relatively small number of people who will do that work for not particularly high wages. But if you want to get more output, you're going to have to offer quite high wages to get extra people into the market, people who aren't interested in doing that work because it's difficult. Or you're going to have to pay your existing workers a lot of overtime to work those extra hours. That could also make your marginal costs increase relatively quickly. Next, we have the market share of inputs. And market share here means the following. If you're producing a product, you have a number of different inputs that you have to buy, raw materials and labor force, and you've got utilities that you're probably going to have to pay for and the like. All right, now it could be that on some of those inputs, your company or your industry buys most of the output for that input. So for example, let's say that you are producing beer. If you're making beer, then you need to buy hops. Okay? Well, guess what? It turns out that 100% of all the hops that are grown in the world get used for making beer. So if you want to produce more beer, more hops are going to need to be grown. All right? So that if you're a beer company, it might be difficult for you to buy that extra hops to expand your production if no other beer company is willing to reduce its production. Similarly, 80% of all of the tar that gets produced as a byproduct of drilling oil goes into paving roads. And so if you want to pave more roads, say in the United States, you're going to need to increase the size of the oil industry. More oil is going to need to be drilled so you can get that additional tar. On the other hand, you can have markets where the inputs are a very small share of that market. So for example, if you're going to produce toothpicks, you need wood for producing toothpicks. Well, the toothpick market is a very small share of all of the lumber that gets produced in the United States in a given year. So you're not going to drive up the price of trees by producing 100% more toothpicks or 50% more toothpicks, because toothpicks make up such a small share of the market for trees. Next, you've got the geographic scope to which the supply curve refers. So local supply curves are going to be flatter. They're more elastic. Global supply curves will be relatively steep and inelastic. Why would that be the case? Well, think about the local supply of something like gasoline. Okay, Chapman University is in the city of Orange. And you can imagine if the price of gasoline goes up just in the city of Orange, not in Orange County generally or in California generally, just in our local city. If that price went up by just a little bit while the prices outside of the city stayed the same, it would be very easy to ship in more gasoline from neighboring cities. Fullerton, Brea, Yorba Linda, Irvine, Anaheim. They could all quickly ship some of their gasoline to Orange. If our price went up by a little bit, that would be a profit opportunity for sellers of gas in those other areas. All right. But now think about if it's not just the city of Orange where the price is going up, but maybe it's all of Orange County. All right. Well, now, yes, you could ship in gasoline from Los Angeles and from maybe San Diego, but there's less supply outside of Orange County than there is supply outside of the city of Orange. Okay, so it's going to be more difficult and more costly to ship that gasoline from those other locations. And if you crank it up all the way to the global supply, well, if the entire world has an increase in the price of gasoline, we can get more oil, but we're going to have to drill more oil wells and create more, build more refineries. We're going to have to build out our entire oil and gas refining industries in order to get an increase in the quantity supplied globally of gasoline. Okay, so with local supply, you can just kind of shift in supply from elsewhere. You can ship it from neighboring areas. With global supply, you just have to make more of it altogether. Okay, and for regional supply or national supply, of course, it's going to fall somewhere in the middle. Finally, we have the time span to which the supply curve pertains. Just like consumers, suppliers find it easier to respond to changes in price in the long run than it is easy to respond to those changes in price in the short run. So, for example, take an industry like 30-year whiskey. Okay, if the price of 30-year whiskey goes up by 20% or 50%, that doesn't allow you to increase your quantity supplied very quickly because you made your decision about how much 30-year whiskey to have today. You made that decision 30 years ago. Now, of course, you might have some casks that are, you were going to open them now. They're 15 years old. They're 20 years old. You can leave them sealed for the next 10 years or 15 years so that, in the future you have a greater supply. And today you could start distilling a lot more whiskey for 30 years from now, but the immediate short-run supply curve of 30-year whiskey is going to be pretty steep, right? It's going to be quite inelastic. But over the long run, the 60-year supply or 100-year supply of 30-year whiskey, that can be very elastic because you've got plenty of time in that century or 60 years to set aside plenty of whiskey and let it age for 30 years. So over a 60-year time horizon, you could easily double or quintuple or multiply by 10 the quantity supplied for just a fairly small increase in the price. But in the short run, you're not going to be very responsive to changes in price.